with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. You go by Lexi, but Alexa's your full name, right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
Alexia is my full
Yeah.
name. That's what you'll find me on from University of Maryland Extension, but I go by Lexi.
Okay. And she is our new home horticulture educator in Baltimore County. So if you're in Baltimore County, come to some of her programs. And she's going to be talking to us today about Vegetable Gardening 101. So this talk is really meant to be an introduction or really just best practices for getting started with a garden.
Okay, thank you for the intro, Haley and Emily. So if you've ever been to a program before with us, you've probably seen this. Our programs are meant to be accessible to all as we're federally funded by the USDA. If you don't find that this program is accessible, after asking us for certain accommodations, you always have the USDA to reach out to. These are resources for you. And then again, this is our assurance statement. And then also just to give you context to where I fall in within University of Maryland. So I work for University of Maryland Extension, which falls in underneath the College of Ag and Natural Resources, which falls in within University of Maryland. And then, as I said, I also coordinate Master Gardeners, and they're one program within Extension. So today's topics, we're going to talk about planning a garden. So I'm not going to go over this in detail, but these are all the things that all of my slides are going to cover. Everything you have to consider when you're getting started with a vegetable garden. So you want to plan ahead of time when you are thinking about a garden because there's a lot to consider. Considering plant spacing and pathways and considering how you're going to group your plants based on their seasonal needs, how long they take to mature, and how you might want to do succession planting. I will get more into these things in detail, but just to say, creating a drawing of how you're going to map out your plants so that as you go through the season, you know what your setup is, what you're expecting. And you also want to plant your taller crops on north and west side to consider the sun, especially things that you're going to want to put on trellises. Okay, and then there are multiple types of gardens. So we've got in-ground gardens, raised bed gardens, and container gardens. And I'll talk a little bit about why you would consider each of these options. So in-ground gardens are great because they use existing soil and they're less startup work. They're also less permanent. And this makes them cheaper. You want to do organic amendment because your soil may or may not be already amended, may or may not already have nutrients that your vegetables will need. Irrigation is a little bit easier because you don't have extra stuff that's built up. You don't have extra tools and infrastructure. You're going to want to mound up though when you're on an in-ground bed. So you can see that the dirt is raised up in between these pathways of hay. And that's so that when there's a lot of water that comes in at once, it can fall off to the sides. So our plants won't get inundated with extra water. That mound allows the water to run off. The other thing with in-ground gardens, one of the downsides is that they're weedier because, depending on the space that you put in between your beds and the surrounding area, there's no hard barrier that's preventing those weeds from growing in. So they might be weedier, but this is a less permanent option and a little bit easier to get started with. Raised bed gardens are great because they can provide you with a little bit longer of a growing season because they're not in the ground. The sun has an easier time warming up those beds. There's also less weeds because there's those barriers, and there's better drainage because it's soil that you've put in the system, and it's not, you're not working with only the soil texture that your space naturally has. There's also better access for gardeners with physical limitations. Obviously, you can raise the beds up to the level that works for you. And those boundaries make it easy for people to understand where the garden is versus where the pathway is. Some of the drawbacks to raised bed gardening is that there's more startup work and cost, and they're also more permanent. So this is something to consider if you're a renter or an owner. How long will you be gardening in this space? So how much time do you want to put into the infrastructure? Okay, and then container gardening. This is a great option if you don't have a lawn space to call your own. If you have a patio, a deck, or a balcony, this can work for small spaces. It's pretty easy setup, though there is some cost. So that's, getting the containers and then also getting the potting mix. In this situation, you get potting mix, not soil. You want to make sure that your container has drainage because you don't want to waterlog your plants. One of the benefits is that there will be less weeds. but you will have to water and fertilize more often because there's just less soil space for that water and for those nutrients to be held within. Then there's also spacing or size limitations based on your containers and just not overcrowding those plants, because all of our plants need room to expand their roots out. And considering that volume, as I was saying, so larger vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants are going to need 8 to 10 gallons for their roots to grow to full capacity, whereas medium and smaller vegetables will only need 4 to 6 gallons or 1 to 3 gallons. So this is to think about, how much space do you have on your balcony? And within that space, what can you grow? I know I live in an apartment with a balcony. I'm going to start with herbs because I live on a third floor apartment and I don't want to carry that dirt up. So thinking about your limitations is important. Okay, and then site selection. So things to consider are sun, soil, temperature, water, and nutrients, or compost specifically I put down. So for warm season crops, they want 6 to 8 hours of direct sun a day, whereas cool season crops want 3 to 5 hours of direct sun a day. And you want to avoid bordering trees and shrubs that are going to block the sun. So having an open space, and as I said in that earlier slide, having your taller stuff be to the north and west side to avoid shading out your garden. As far as your soil, you want to learn about the texture. You're not going to change the texture necessarily, but if you know that you have very clayey soil, you'll know that that soil is going to hold more water and nutrients versus a sandier soil will be easier to drain. So just knowing about your soil texture will help you prepare for the future, how to address issues that you come across. For temperature, we're in the zone that we're in, so when our season starts and generally what the growing conditions of Maryland are. But then there's also some smaller climates. So the climate within your area, are you in a valley? Are you on a mountaintop? And even just within your specific area, does your house have a white siding that reflects a lot of heat that increases the temperature in that area? Things like that are to consider how those will affect your warm season versus your cool season crops. And then water is really important. You're going to need a water source nearby. So that's something to consider in terms of your site selection, and as well as if you have a compost pile, if you choose a site that's far away from your compost pile, that's not as convenient. So that's another thing to consider. And site preparation, there's a few different things to consider. So terracing is just if you're on a hill, you want to terrace that space out before you start planting, but it would be ideal to be on a flat space. Fencing is very important. We all have deer in our backyards, unless you're really in the city. So if you know that you have deer in and around your space, you're going to want to fence before you start growing, because they will come and enjoy the harvest that you've provided for them. And then removing that turf grass. You have a few options for removing your turf grass. One is smothering. That's to the left, that image there. That shows a black tarp that covers the grass for a long period of time. I think it can be this would be something you would do in the fall, really, because it can take months to kill that soil underneath. But this is better than solarizing, which is putting a clear tarp over, because that can kill beneficial microbes as well as the grass, which you actually want to kill. So smothering is a good kind of slow, long-term kill your grass option. And then just to show you another option is sheet mulching. In this situation, you would want to cut your grass short, lay down your newspaper, and then cover it with a few inches of compost. You can plant directly into sheet mulching, even if it's not fully broken down. And it's okay to have paper or cardboard in your garden as long as it's not treated with anything special, no special or laminated or glossy paper, but newspaper and regular printer paper and cardboard without tape on it is okay. It will break down. As I said, water is essential. Water is also heavy. So you want to think about where your water source is and how you're going to get that to your garden. In terms of actually doing the watering, you want to water in the morning at the base of the plant. It's okay to water the leaves, but the leaves aren't absorbing the water. The roots are what are going to absorb the water. And sometimes when leaves are left wet for a long time, it can make them vulnerable to some bacteria diseases. So it's recommended that you water at the base of your plant. Drip irrigation is one method, though that has its own cost and startup effort. These two images show you drip irrigation, the two left images, where they're just going around the plants, and that goes right to the base of the plant. So that's a good system in that way. The other thing to consider is that young plants are going to want frequent, more shallow watering because their roots are not as deep into the ground. So as soon as the first 2 inches of soil have dried out, those roots of a baby plant aren't going to be able to access the water that's deeper down. So that's why we water it more frequently, and we don't worry about watering deeply into the soil for our younger transplants, versus once plants become mature, we want to water deeper into the ground, and we might not have to water as frequently because they can reach water and nutrients further into the ground than those baby plants that don't have those established root systems. Generally, we don't recommend using rain barrel water on vegetables because you don't know what's on your roof and you don't know if you want that in something that you're going to eat. But adding mulch, hay, or compost can also help retain moisture. So these are good things to amend on top of your soil to ensure that that moisture that you put in will remain. You can also look into getting these kind of rain measurers, and that will tell you how much your space got watered by the rain and how much you might accordingly want to water in yourself. Soil testing, to get back to soil for a bit, is something that we recommend you do every 3 years. You can go to a professional lab and they will test the pH and the fertility. So that includes nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. This shouldn't be too expensive of an endeavor, but it'll really help you understand what nutrients are available to the plants in your soil versus what you might need to amend. So turf grass it doesn't provide a lot to the soil, and it takes a lot. So when you start in a space that might have just been turf grass, it will likely want or need some amending to have vegetables grow successfully. And then the other thing to consider too is pH. So pH helps you understand if those nutrients in the soil are actually accessible. So depending on the pH, you can see this graph here, depending on the pH, become more or less available. So it sometimes might make more sense that your pH has to be adjusted rather than actually amending the soil with added nutrients. And then soil amending. So after you've had your soil test and you understand what you're working with, you can get amendments that will help that soil, enrich that soil for the plants that you plan to grow. Whenever you see these, there's always 3 numbers, and that's always NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We don't want to over-fertilize. That's important to consider. It's mindful to the environment to only fertilize as necessary. And another great way to fertilize is using organic matter, whether that's compost, leaves, grass clippings. Those provide great nutrients as they break down. And then keeping your plant covered with plants or mulch will help those nutrients be retained. So this is why people often do ground covers, or mulching is another option, because we want soil to be a living organism with all its bacteria and the things that we don't see moving around, enriching the nutrients. So when soil is just left uncovered with nothing in it, we're not adding to it anyway. There's only potential for nutrients and erosion to be leached, and erosion to happen. So as much as we can cover our soil, we are saving our soil. Why compost? So compost contains those necessary nutrients for plant growth, as well as improving the soil structure. It's literally the breakdown of your food scraps and leaves. So it's these extra things that we wouldn't consume, but have those same nutrients. And if we break them down in compost, we can reuse them and put that back into the ecosystem rather than taking them to a landfill where they will cause detriment to our environment by being in that landfill space and breaking down there versus the positive impact that they could have breaking down and being compost and going back into our garden space. There are a plethora of ways to compost. This rotating barrel is just one option. And then to explain how composting works. So organic material plus microorganisms plus time. Eventually you get this homogeneous, rich organic material that we call humus. It's very similar to the food we eat, but there's only one M and it's different. Um, so yeah, what it is it's worms and different microorganisms eating that material and digesting it, and what they leave behind has that nutrients, but it's in a homogeneous way that's been um, processed, and so that we can put it back into our gardens and use those nutrients again. And then compost do's and don'ts. So you want to cover your soil or cover your compost. You could cover your compost for moisture and smell control. Your compost core should reach 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So these microorganisms hard at work, they heat it up. That's what causes the heat, is them eating and digesting. And once you'll know your compost is ready when it's homogeneous, like that bottom picture. That top picture, we can still see pieces of our food scraps not broken down. So we wouldn't be ready to put that in our garden. But below, it's homogeneous. And the other thing is too, that when you turn your compost and the temperature doesn't raise again, that's another indication that those microbes are done with their work. And the other thing to consider is, do you want to include weeds in your compost? You can see here that it can take 30 days at 140 degrees to kill weed seeds. So if you aren't sure if your weeds have gone to seed, just leave them out, because you don't want to add a bunch of weeds into your system because you unknowingly had them in your compost. But if you know that your weeds have not gone to seed, there is no damage. It's just that it's the reseeding aspect that is why you want to consider if you want to add the weeds or not. And then what to grow. You've decided on your space, you've decided if you're going to compost or how you're going to get water to it, but what do you want to grow? Well, it's really about what do you like to eat. So vegetables, small fruits like shrubbing fruits are pretty easy to get started with. Herbs are really good, and flowers too. Tree fruit is a bit more complex, so you might want to hold off on that until you're more confident in your capacity to troubleshoot as things come up, because gardening is a lot of just trying, failing, asking questions and trying again, or doing again a little bit differently and seeing if it works better. So trialing with something that isn't as long of a commitment or maybe a little less complicated than tree fruit is what I would recommend. And then in terms of what to grow to, you're thinking about your space and location, how much cost this is going to have, and what time you have to contribute to your garden space. When you go to the store and you buy a seed packet, it will say either it's a cultivar, a hybrid, or an heirloom. And this kind of indicates the history of that plant, that specific vegetable or fruit that you're buying that seed for. If it's a cultivar, it's a cultivated variety of a specific crop. So they specifically bred it to have genes and produce something fairly homogeneous. Hybrid is a result of breeding two cultivars, and that's probably because they want to get an attribute that's disease resistant or insect resistant. Those seeds are not true to type, so you can't necessarily rely on the seeds of those fruits getting you back to the hybrid that you bought seeds for. I hope that makes sense. And then heirloom are open pollinated and non-hybrid. So these are older cultivars that have been saved and have a little less homogeneity between every plant and every fruit that gets produced. Like if you've seen heirloom tomatoes, that's, I think, the best example of, they look a lot different than the Roma tomato that is fairly uniform whenever you're looking at that in the grocery store. Okay, and seed packets and plant labels are going to give you a pretty good understanding of how to treat those seeds and plants. So we can see this beet packet, it says red ace hybrid, so we know it's a hybrid, and it says too that it's resistant to hot weather, so that's probably what they hybridized. A beet that's tasty and a beet that is resistant to hot weather, and then you get something in the middle that is tasty and also resistant to hot weather. And then it also tells you the depth, the spacing, if you want to direct seed or not, moist, days to germination, if you want to thin it out. So with direct seeding, often you want to overseed. So say you're spacing out your beets to be 2 inches apart, but you might plant 3 seeds in each spot rather than just one, because what if 2 don't germinate? Then if you'd only had planted the one, you wouldn't have gotten any at all. So often what we do is we overseed and then we go back in and we thin out. So even this seed packet says space after thinning to tell you how you want to optimally have those seedlings thinned out once they've germinated. And also when you're planting, you want to plant into moist soil. Okay. Okay. Seeds versus transplants. So you can buy seeds, start from seeds, or you can buy transplants. And these have pros and cons both. So seeds are a little more resource intensive, but okay, they're more time intensive and thought intensive for you, but they're might be cheaper in terms of the materials versus transplants might be a little more expensive to buy, but you didn't have to do the work to get them started. So it's really what's optimal to you. And these are just suggestions of, what might be worth buying as transplants versus what you might want to start from seed. Okay, I went to plant. There is a planting calendar with University of Maryland Extension that gives you a really good detailed understanding of when to plant different vegetables throughout the season. This QR code takes you directly to that page with University of Maryland Extension. And you'll have this presentation to come back to. But that planting calendar is a great resource to know when to plant different things. And then as far as starting your seeds, if you're starting your seeds indoors, there's some resources that you're going to want to have. So you're going to want to have quality seeds, you're going to want to have containers, and you're going to have the right environment for those seeds. You probably also want labels because you want to know once your seeds have started to grow, which is which. As far as containers, you want clean containers with drainage holes. Clear coverings help maintain humidity. Let me see if this next picture. Yeah, okay. So clear containers, I like to use, reuse produce containers because reduce, reuse, recycle, but that also provides that housing. It's like basically creating a little mini greenhouse for those seedlings to hold in that humidity, which they like a lot of moisture when they're first getting started. The other resources that you need, that right environment for the seeds, that includes medium, light, water, and air. So you want your medium to be a soilless starting mix. This means it's a fairly neutral situation for these seeds to start in. There's not a lot of things that are going to be challenging. It has the necessary nutrients just to get started. And then as far as light, you could either set it close to the window or you could use artificial lights. If you do use artificial lights, you want to keep them close to the plants to avoid leggy growth. Leggy growth means the stem grows long and there's a lot of space between all the leaves. So you want to have your plant have leaves keeping close together because that's best for it, rather than spreading out because it's trying to reach the light. So keeping the light source close to those seedlings is the best way to go. As far as watering, bottom watering is optimal. So this means, in the picture to the right, you can see bottom right, you can see they're putting water into the tray and then the water will percolate up into that soil and absorb it as needed. So this allows the water or the plants, the little seedlings, it helps them grow their roots down. So when you then transplant it, they continue that practice of trying to plant or grow their roots deep into the ground so they continue to find more water. Whereas if we only water from the top, there's not as much encouragement to do that downward growth so that when they are in the ground, they won't be reaching for that water that stays longer in the soil deeper down. So bottom watering is optimal. And then air, you want to have some circulation that again promotes strong stems. That could even just be like running your hand over the seedlings every once in a while just to give them that a little bit of movement, a little bit of activity, because eventually they're going to go outside and there's going to be a lot more activity. Okay, so next steps, once you have your seedlings, once they've emerged, you want to make sure they're in a bright location that's not too hot, not too cool. And then 1 to 2 weeks prior to you're going to plant them in the ground, you want to start hardening them off. So hardening off means you take them outside for a little bit of time on warmer days, and then you bring them in at night, and you increase the amount of sunlight that those transplants receive the longer that you practice this hardening off process. This allows the seedlings to adjust to the wind, to the amount of sun, to the temperatures. So bringing them in at night at first and then slowly getting them used to it so that once you do put them in the ground, they've gotten used to those conditions. And then in terms of interplanting or companion planting. So you've got your plants outside or you've got your tomatoes started. Do you want to plant anything nearby your tomato to promote growth or pollination? That's kind of the purpose of interplanting or companion planting. I don't know if you've ever heard of the three sisters. That's the picture on the bottom left, but that's squash, beans, and corn. And that's a great example of companion planting that's been practiced forever because that corn stalk is helpful to the beans. The squash covers the ground and keeps the weeds out. Yeah, the corn is also a great nutrient or food itself. So the beans and the corn work together, as well as they're providing nutrients to the soil. They all have their own interactions with the soil that provide nutrients. So this is a great example of companion planting that considers the rooting patterns, the nutrient needs, and the lighting and shade needs of all of those plants. With the tomato picture, there are marigolds because they attract beneficial insects that will help you ensure pollination. A big part of companion planting really is it enhances each plant's experience or your produce from each plant because they're building on each other. And then succession planting is another kind of term and thing to consider that will maximize your yield. So green beans, for instance, those plants will produce really great fruits for a few weeks, but then once they've produced for a few weeks, those bean pods will start being a little harder and tougher and not as enjoyable for us to eat. So sometimes people will start plants a few weeks apart. They have their fruit and green beans, they enjoy those green beans, and once they get to the point where they're not enjoyable anymore, they rip that plant out and they put the next plant in. And this goes back to planning your garden, right? Like if this is something that you want to do, where you want to plant in succession, you need to have access to that space to do so. So having that map from the get-go of what your plan is throughout the season in that space is going to ensure that you've thought everything through. And then as well, things to consider for that area, even if you're not planting the same species, in the same space, doing succession planting that way, in the same space, you could consider doing a cool season crop, and then a warm season crop, and then a cool season crop again to maximize your season and get the most out of that space with different produce. Plant spacing too. So this picture on the left, there's 6 to 7 feet between those, and you can walk the aisles, you can weed, you can get to the fruit. That's great. That's what you want. The picture on the right, there's only about 4 feet of space in between those lines of tomatoes, and you can't walk through that. You can't weed that. You can't access all the fruit. Not only thinking about spacing when you first start, the plants are not going to stay the size that you see them when you first purchase them or when they first emerge, right? They're going to grow big. So when you think about your plant spacing, you're thinking about that at maximum size, at maturity, not just at the beginning. Okay, general care tips. Again, mulching is a great way to reduce weeds, retain moisture, make your life a little bit easier with the maintenance. Watering at the base of the plant in the morning maximizes the use of that water and prevents more evaporation of that water. And then fertilizing as necessary. Of course, that's something to keep in mind. Another care tip are for some plants, you're gonna need support systems. So you've seen tomato cages before. Sometimes people make them themselves. You can see there's like a string trellis in the back of this picture that they have created to support their plants. And then are also just monitoring your plants regularly. So as I said before, a lot of this is just trial and error. And if you see, one leaf turning yellow, that's not an issue. But if you come back 4 days later and 6 leaves are yellow on the same plant, maybe something's happening. Maybe you want to pay attention to, is there a pest nearby? Is it stressed by the heat? Is it not getting enough water? So just monitoring your plants regularly, that's how you're going to learn the best from trial and error. Okay, and then just a little bit about specific plant needs. So these plants here need high nitrogen. So again, that NPK, 15 nitrogen, 5 phosphorus, 5 potassium. That's something to consider in terms of these are high nitrogen needing plants. These need more of a balance, so 10, 10, 10. And then these guys aren't as needy, 5, 10, 10. And the other thing, okay, let me go back to this. I don't think I put this in here, but crop rotation is another thing to consider in terms of how you're picking your plants. So different plant families provide different nutrients to the soil. So you might one season do a legume in an area, and then the next season you might do something from the brassica family like broccoli. And then the next season you might do a potato. So that allows the soil to interact with all of those different plants and for those plants to amend and improve the soil based on their specific relationship and the way that their roots work. So crop rotation really helps boost the strength of your soil. And pollination. So most of the edibles that you're growing require pollination. This is a little sweaty. He's a sweet little guy. Pollination is the transfer of pollen to the female reproductive organs of a flower. Some plants have male and female flowers, so you need to get the pollen from those male flowers to the female flowers. Some have both parts in one. So squash and pumpkins, for instance, are plants that have separate female and male flowers. And that means that not every flower is going to produce a fruit because only female flowers are going to produce fruit. Whereas plants that have the flower has both the male and female parts, each flower will theoretically produce a fruit. This down here shows an example of poor pollination. Well, how can we improve pollination if we feel like our pollination is poor? We can attract beneficial insects, and I will be talking about that soon. Okay, before I get to the beneficial insects, these are examples of some garden pests. So on the top left, the orange insects are aphids. Top right are whiteflies, and you can see their eggs. Bottom left is a hornworm, and then bottom right is it's either a potato beetle or a cucumber beetle. I cannot remember which, I apologize. But these are all guys we don't really want to see around. They're kind of a pain in the booty. So before you get to treating things though, you want to make sure you know the bug that you're interacting with. So like aphids are fairly clear to understand. You can tell what an aphid is. You might be able to tell what a hornworm is, but you don't want to crush or start treating things that are actually beneficial insects. So knowing what you're working with is an important first step before you start treating or doing anything to the bugs that you see. Once you know, okay, this is a pest, these are some ways that you can treat that. So crushing the eggs, crushing the bugs, like stink bugs, for instance, they're kind of a pain in the butt, so you can crush those and their eggs. But again, if you're crushing eggs, you want to know that you're crushing the eggs of a pest, not of a beneficial. So this is why monitoring your garden and learning what's going on is how to start rather than just going at it. Covering, whether that's with row covers, mesh, that prevents bugs from getting in. And coating, some larger scale growing operations will coat their plants with kaolin clay. They'll put kaolin clay in with water and then they'll spray their plants, and that prevents the bugs from feeding on those plants. So that's an option. But I would say crushing and covering are the more accessible how to get started steps. Diversifying your landscape. So you want to diversify your landscape in plant type and in the structure. So trees, vines, shrubs, flowering plants. By diversifying your landscape, you're attracting beneficial insects, which will help you naturally weed out those pests. Practicing companion planting is another way to attract beneficial insects. And then these are beneficial insects. This is not exhaustive by any means. There are so many bugs in this world. Mantids, they're a great generalist predator. So anytime you see a mantis, let it do its thing. It will eat up things that you don't want to see. Guy that just looks like, he's not a slug. He's a sawfly larva, but he doesn't look like much. He actually is really great at eating aphids. And so we want to let them stick around. This is an assassin bug. It's just one type. He's another beneficial that'll eat a lot of things we don't want around. And then to the right, this top right photo, I want to point out, that's a ladybug larva. A lot of people don't know what ladybug larvae look like, but they are so good at eating aphids, mites, thrips, all these small pests that we don't want. So anytime you see this guy, let him live. He's not a pest. And then bottom left is a parasitoid wasp. So some wasps will lay eggs on pests that then cause them to deteriorate in their health. These guys are very sensitive to chemicals. So even though they're tiny and mighty in terms of how much damage they can do to our pests, they're also sensitive to chemicals. So that's a reason not to spray or, put anything that you don't need into your system. And then this is a lacewing, this bottom right brown guy. There's also green lacewings. As I said, this is not exhaustive of beneficials, but just a few examples. Okay, and again, how to attract beneficials. Leave the leaves, even if that means you rake your leaves off into a corner of your garden and you don't keep them by where you're going to keep you're growing your produce yourself. That's fine too. A lot of these bugs overwinter in leaves. So when we put them into bags and send them off to the landfill, we are entirely removing them from our system. And that's not what we want to do. We want them to overwinter and stay in our system so that the next year around, they can kill off our pests. Diversifying our landscape, as I said, not only in plant type, but also in structure. So different native plants, different vegetable plants, things that grow long and skinny, things that grow along trellises, things that grow low to the ground, providing spaces for beneficials of all different types to make their homes as they need in your space. These are some resources for you guys. So University of Maryland Extension has Ask Extension specifically, which you can put in pictures, titles, ask your question, and an extension professional will get back to you directly with your specific question. That said, the Home and Garden Information Center also has a wealth of information on University of Maryland Extension's website and on HJC's website. Both of those are great resources. And then your master gardeners, they're another great resource. Every county in Maryland and Baltimore City too has master gardeners that are out in the community doing teaching events or having ask a master gardener tables. And they're another great resource for questions you have. If you want to see someone in person, go find them at a farmer's market and they will happily get you answers. Okay. Yeah. And come find me in Baltimore County. If you live out here, I'm your agent. So you can reach me and find me at University of Maryland Extension. I'll put my email in the chat just one time.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you with us.